I thought I should make a little video for people who serve in small churches. This is specifically for you. And that's really why I started Leading Worship Well. As I looked at all of the worship leading resources online, which are amazing, and I think that they're great. We can learn a lot from them. What I saw back 5 years ago when I started Leading Worship Well was that most of them were from large churches for large churches. Or if they were from large churches, they said you can apply this to small churches, but I think sometimes when we serve in large churches, we don't actually understand all the intricacies of the small church and some of the unique struggles that they face. And so why I created Leading Worship Well was actually specifically to speak to small church worship leaders. And that's why I so often talk about the fundamentals on this channel and not gear and things that you have to buy or having a million worship team members on your team and how to manage them all. Although sometimes I do talk about how to manage your worship team. But my point is, the things I talk about, I try as hard as I can to make sure that they are applicable on a foundational level so that no matter what size your church is, you can use what I talk about and apply it to your ministry. And so with that in mind, I thought, man, I just need to encourage small church worship leaders with, I didn't even know if this is practical advice. I think that this is just encouragement to you to let you know that you are okay. You're doing a good job. You're doing what you can with what you have, and God is blessing it and using it for His glory. And I've seen comments many times on my channel that are like, Spencer, I serve in a small church. I know that you probably, your situation is different because I'm sure you serve in a large church. Listen, I do not serve in a large church. Here, I don't usually turn the camera around. You might have seen my church tour video. Here's my church. There it is. And my church, that space holds, I think, like 200 people max. All right. But what is the actual attendance on Sunday? Well, let me share this with you. Can you see that? There are my attendance numbers for the past year. About 100 to 125 people on Sundays. That's the size of the church that I serve in, if you were ever wondering. And so I serve in a small church. I consider a small church anything under 200 people. I know that there are different levels even in that. A church of 25 to a church of 50 to a church of 100. There are differences between those. But I think that I can provide encouragement for everybody who falls in that church under 200 people. So here's the first piece of encouragement I want to give you, and I've kind of already hinted at it, but you aren't alone in serving in a small church. I know sometimes it feels that way, but Lifeway Research did some research. Imagine that, Lifeway Research did some research. They did some research and they found that the majority of evangelical Protestant churches average around 65 people in attendance on Sunday mornings. That is the majority of churches in America. And so I know that it can feel like, man, I see all these big churches and I focus on the big churches in my town, and the big churches get all of the attention. And I'm not even saying that there's anything wrong with that. Of course, if you have more people coming to your church, you're able to do more things, especially out in the community. And so you probably get more attention than the smaller churches. We don't do things for attention though, right? We do things to glorify God. And what you do in a church of 65 people is equally as glorifying to God as what a church of 1,500 people does. And so I just wanted to start there because I want you to know that you are in the majority. That's why I'm making this video. If the majority of churches weren't under 65 people, then I probably wouldn't be talking to that target audience specifically, because I want to help as many people as possible. And I know that the most amount of worship leaders serve in small churches. All right. So I'm speaking to you on this channel. I want you to know that I have that commitment to you. Now, let's talk about a piece of practical encouragement for you, a statistical encouragement. And that is, I've talked about it before on this channel, but what is the one thing that we want as worship leaders in a small church? I hear it over and over again. Man, I just want more people for my worship team. I wish I had a bass player. I wish I had an electric guitarist. I wish I had a drummer. I wish I had someone who could fill my spot on Sunday so that I could finally take a Sunday off. I get it. We want more people on our worship team. First of all, let me just say that your worship is no less pleasing to God if you are leading with an acoustic guitar as opposed to if you had 3 electric guitars, a bass player, a drummer, an auxiliary percussionist, 2 keyboard players, a pad player, 4 background vocalists, and a choir behind you. There's nothing inherently more glorifying about that situation than if you are leading authentic, biblical worship in your church right now. So, what is the piece of encouragement? I guess that was sort of part of it, but I want to encourage you that in your church, there's this thing called the 80-20 rule. And that is, the general idea is that 80% of the work in your church, the ministry in your church, will statistically be done by 20% of the people. Now, I want to be very careful because I want to say that that is not the statistic that we're aiming for, but that is a statistical reality. Obviously, we want everybody to be serving in our church, glorifying God and using their gifts to build up the body, right? That is what we want. But statistically speaking, there will be 20% of people in your church who do 80% of the ministry, who come to 80% of the church functions, who serve diligently in the children's ministry and on the worship team and in the sound booth. And the reason that I bring this up is not that we don't want the other 80% who are only participating 20%. It's not that we don't want them to be involved, but my point in bringing up this statistic is that if somebody is going to be on the worship team, I believe that they have become some sort of leader in the church. And when people see them, they associate them with being a leader in the church. And so, not only that, but the worship team takes a big commitment. If somebody isn't willing to be on that side, at least edging towards that side of being 80% committed, whatever that means. I know we're supposed to be all in for Christ, but I'm just trying to put arbitrary numbers to it. If somebody isn't at least 80% into doing ministry in your church, then we probably don't want them on the worship team, because leading the church gathering is a high calling. And so we don't want people who are only going to show up twice a year to play on the worship team. We don't want people who aren't going to put in the time outside of practice to make sure that they are ready to lead worship. All of these things stem from the 80% who only do 20% of the work. So my point in bringing up that ratio is that that statistical reality means that you have 20% of the people in your church who probably are what I call high capacity volunteers, or high, I don't know if value is the right word, but they are the people who are extremely dedicated. They are the people who we would want on our worship team. Now, the problem is that not all of them are musicians. And so there's generally 10 to 20% of the population who are musicians. We'll take the middle of that and say 15% of that 20% are musicians. I know that this sounds convoluted, but let me put it in proper terms. That means that if you have 100 people in your church, 20 of them will be your dedicated, diehard volunteers. Out of those 20%, only 15% of them will be musicians, which is 3 people. So when I bring up the 80-20 principle, it is to show you that if you serve in a church of 100 people and you only have 3 people on your worship team, that is statistically normal, and you aren't doing anything inherently wrong with what you're doing. So if you want more people on your worship team, the goal, I guess, yes, technically could be to encourage your people to use their gifts as God has called us to, and try to increase that ratio. Ultimately, that is what we want to do. But another method would be to make sure that you have more people in your church, to grow your church. How do we grow our church? We do it by sharing the gospel and bringing in unbelievers from the outside, and those unbelievers who are now become believers and join the gathering of your church. Some of them will be musicians, and eventually, when they are spiritually ready, be able to join your worship team. So the encouragement is, if you serve in a church of 100 people and you only have 3 people on your worship team, Or if you serve in a church of 50 people and it's just you on the worship team, or you and one other person, because statistically speaking, you would expect 1.5 people to be on your worship team in a church of 50 people, you aren't doing anything wrong. So don't focus so much on that. If there are people in your church who have gifts to use on the worship team and are spiritually at a place where they can lead the people of God in worship, then yes, utilize them, even if it goes out of that statistic. But if you serve in a church of 100 people and you're like, I want 10 people on my worship team, that's 10% of your church. That's a big ask. So I just want to encourage you. You're probably right where you need to be with the amount of worship team members on your worship team. If you want to grow your worship team, train up people, ask people in your church, but ultimately, we want to see our church grow because we are sharing the gospel with people who have not heard it yet or received it yet. The third encouragement is that church is fundamentally simple. I know once we start getting more people in our church, we're able to do more things, and there's nothing wrong with that, and we probably should be doing a lot of those things, more small groups, maybe some outreach events, serving our community, all for the sake of sharing the gospel with them, not just meeting physical needs, but meeting spiritual needs. But those things, the amount of those things that you do not make a church a church. Everything that God has revealed in the Bible that he describes as making up a church can be done in a church of 1,000 people, in a church of 10,000 people, in a church of 100 people, in a church of 25 people. What do? We gather together on a consistent basis to encourage each other, to point each other back to the gospel, because the gospel sanctifies us as we remember the work that Jesus has done. We gather together to study his word, gather together to pray, we gather together to hear the word preached to us, we gather together to worship God, and we go out. We don't just gather together as the church, but we are sent out as the church to share the gospel message with people. None of that is dependent on how many people you have in your church. So don't feel like your church is less than because you don't have as many people. You can do everything that God has told us to do as a church, all of his commands for us as the church. What he has revealed to us in his word, we can do no matter the size of our church. And it is all glorifying to God. The fourth encouragement is that the grass is not greener somewhere else. Barring any sort of spiritual malpractice, immorality in the eldership of your church, simply being in a small church is not a good enough reason by itself to leave a church. We don't just pick a church because it's bigger, because when you go to that bigger church, the grass isn't greener. You're going to find out that the more people you have, probably the more problems you have. And I always remember, I think Christian Stanfill said it in some interview a long time ago. I've got to find that again. But they were asking him, how have you been at your church for so long? Like, how have you not left yet? And he's like, listen, my church isn't perfect. There are struggles in my church. There is conflict. But I know if I go somewhere else, it's not going to get better. And I'm going to have to deal with that conflict now with a group of people that I don't know and that I don't have a loving relationship on a deeper level yet. And so I would rather deal with the conflict where I'm at right now in my church. I'd rather deal with the problems in my church where I'm at right now with the people that I know and love, that I've been with for the past 8 to 10 years, however long you've been at your church, building a relationship with those people. Families fight all the time, but what is the commitment in a family? It is that we don't leave each other when things get hard. It is that we love each other through the difficult times, and that we can argue, and at the end of it, especially in the church, say, I love you anyways, because we are bound together by the blood of Jesus and the common call of the gospel. So the grass is not greener somewhere else. There are problems in my church. There are problems in your church. There are problems in the church down the street. There are problems in Elevation Church. There are problems in Hillsong. There are problems in Passion. And I'm not speaking specifically of theological problems at this point. I'm talking about conflict among people, difficult things happening in the church. All right? It is everywhere. We are a broken people. You leaving to a new church, that new church is not going to be perfect. So figure out how to deal with the problems where you are right now with the people that you have committed yourself to. And the fifth encouragement is that the size of your church does not relieve you from the duty of rest. I know I talked about at the beginning of this video, I want more people on my worship team so that somebody can finally fill in for me on Sunday and I can take a Sunday off. Listen, your church is not built on you. You are not the cornerstone of the church. I always say this, you are important, but you aren't that important. You are important. God wants to use you. God has used you. God wants to, through his Spirit, pour in to other people in your church, but you aren't that important, where if you step away for one Sunday, everything's going to fall apart and you're going to come back and the church will have burnt to the ground for some reason. All right? People will figure out what to do if you aren't there. And I know that this is a tension that people in small churches feel. I've felt this so often. I'm like, I can't step away because who's going to lead worship if I'm not there on Sunday? Guess what? Your church is going to find out something. If you go to your pastor and say, listen, I'm going to take a Sunday off 3 months from now. What can we do to make sure that my spot is filled? You will find a solution together. And when you come back, your church will be standing and God will have been glorified that Sunday. The people will have been edified. And you will realize that the work of God does not depend solely on you. So take a rest. It's going to be okay. Now, if you want some more tips and you serve in a small church, like I said, what I talk about is fundamental to worship leading. One of those resources I put together is called 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading. No matter if you serve in a church of 1,000 people, 10,000 people, or 25 people, these tips will help you improve your worship leading on Sunday because they don't involve buying more gear. They aren't difficult to do. You just have to be aware of them and make the conscious effort to do them. So check that out down in the description below, 5 tips to instantly improve your worship leading. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me today. Small church worship leaders, keep leading worship well.